It was generally agreed, at least among the respectable portion of Flaxborough society, that nothing could be more harmless than a church raffle. The thing had about it an air of sturdy virtue. Parishioners gathered in the vestry, small change rattled dutifully into collecting tins, and a sheaf of pink tickets printed in Louth by a man who did all the local weddings was neatly torn into hopeful halves. This particular raffle was in aid of the Mothers' Union Boiler Fund, and it had been staged in the main hall of St. Saviour's, whose draughts were widely considered more threatening than Satan's. Mrs. Barraclough, a woman of moral stamina and some bulk, had presided over the table of prizes. The most coveted item, by reputation if not by intrinsic worth, was a wicker basket of continental groceries, contributed by the new delicatessen in the High Street. The basket contained, among the more ordinary tinned peaches and biscuits, an alarming sausage in transparent wrapping, a bottle of something dark, labelled in unhelpful Italian, and a cheese the size and colour of a bricklayer's trowel. This foreign assortment drew from the gathering murmurs of cautious awe and a few expressions of doubt about digestion. The winning number was drawn with solemnity by the vicar's wife, a pale lady who seemed faintly apologetic for the entire process. The ticket was pink, of course, and bore the number 417. It was claimed, to a modest ripple of applause, by Mr. Jonas Bligh, a retired pawnbroker of suspiciously prosperous appearance. Mr. Bligh accepted his prize with a smile that suggested less gratitude than possession. His neighbours, being accustomed to his manner, muttered nothing. Yet within 24 hours the basket was no longer in his keeping. By the following morning the whole town buzzed with the curious news that the hamper, so carefully wrapped in cellophane and ribbon, had vanished from Bligh's residence in South Lane. More remarkable still was the manner of its disappearance. It had not, according to his housekeeper, been taken by burglars. The kitchen window was locked, the door secured, and yet the hamper, basket and all, had gone. Only the empty pink raffle ticket remained on the mantelpiece, pinned there by someone's neat hand with a brass drawing pin. Mrs. Chubb from the confectioner's was first to detail the story, and she improved it by adding that the brass pin had certainly not belonged to Mr. Bligh, who never allowed anything sharp in the house for fear of domestic staff helping themselves to the gin. By midday this version had been repeated so widely that the raffle itself, intended to raise funds against the frost, was regarded less as a pious effort than as the opening chapter of a local melodrama. When Inspector Purbright received word of the affair, it was in the form of a brief note, pencilled on a scrap torn from an old calendar that Constable Love had pushed into his blotter tray. Strange business at South Lane. Bligh reports the theft of a raffle prize, whole basket, no sign of entry, pink ticket left behind. The housekeeper was distressed. Kindly advise. Purbright read the message twice as if to test whether the second reading would reveal some overlooked sense. It did not. He sighed very gently, smoothed the note flat, and reached for his hat. It was, after all, a rare thing in Flaxborough to encounter a crime that involved neither drunken brawls nor defective motor lamps. The disappearance of a hamper might not shake the Home Office, but in the precincts of St. Saviour's it was cause enough for a little discreet attention. And so, by the quiet measure of a man unhurried by excitement, Inspector Purbright set out to investigate the small, polite mystery that was already threatening to become the town's principal entertainment of the season. Inspector Purbright arrived in South Lane at an hour when the town's shopkeepers were still sweeping their doorsteps and exchanging early judgments on the weather. The lane itself was narrow, lined with small, respectable houses, and carried an air of genteel suspicion, as though every curtain had the right to twitch at the sight of a stranger. It was in one of these houses, tiddily kept but ostentatiously furnished, that Jonas Bligh had taken up his retired but hardly subdued existence. The housekeeper, Miss Tither, met Purbright at the door with the look of a woman wronged by fate and window polish. She had been, it soon became clear, repeating the story of the vanished hamper to all comers since dawn. Her pale cheeks were mottled with the effort of indignation, and she guided the inspector into the parlour with the air of offering up a scene of crime fit for the crown jewels. On the mantelpiece lay the evidence of a solitary pink raffle ticket, pinned dead centre on a strip of faded wallpaper patterned with stags' heads. Purbright regarded it with the quiet patience of a man accustomed to more substantial exhibits. He touched the brass pin with a finger, then returned his attention to Miss Tither, who was eager to embroider every detail. "No broken locks, Inspector, not a mark on the sill. And the basket is gone, neat as you like, leaving only this token." Her voice quavered in what might have been outrage or admiration. Purbright nodded thoughtfully and asked whether Mr. Bligh had been home at the time. "He went out after supper, sir. A meeting with his lodge brethren. He told me to put the basket safe in the kitchen pantry, which I did. When I came down in the morning, nothing. Not a sausage. Well, the sausage was in it, of course, but it's gone too." The inspector accepted this explanation with the mildest of smiles, then requested a few moments with Mr. Bligh himself. The retired pawnbroker was found in a back room, surrounded by ledgers from which he claimed never entirely to have retired. His manner was cordial, if slightly theatrical, as though he anticipated a full courtroom audience for his grievance. "Inspector, I am the victim here. It was not merely groceries stolen, it was the symbol of fortune. The basket was mine by right of draw, and somebody's enemy has chosen to deprive me of it. The police must not treat this lightly." Purbright murmured assurances of attention, though his gaze lingered more on Bligh's hands, which fiddled nervously with a fountain pen, than on the man's accusations. He asked whom Bligh suspected. "Anyone envious of my luck. Half the town bought tickets. You'll find jealousy is a stronger motive than hunger." The remark was not entirely without merit. By the time Purbright returned to the station, gossip had indeed spread across the market square and beyond. At Mrs. Chubb's sweet shop, the prevailing theory was that Mr. Bligh had drunk too freely of the raffle bottle and mislaid the rest of the hamper himself. In the post office it was believed that the Italian sausage concealed some illicit foreign document, thus explaining its mysterious allure. Meanwhile, outside the drapery, Mrs. Barraclough insisted the whole affair was a judgment upon Bligh's miserly past as a pawnbroker. Flaxborough had never needed much prompting to embroider a story. The raffle provided ample thread. In the snug of the Hand and Shears public house, 3 old cronies declared with conviction that Bligh had staged the disappearance himself to avoid offering samples of the basket's contents to neighbours. "He'd rather lose it than share it," concluded one amid nods. Such theories were carried into the evening edition of the Flaxborough Chronicle, where the disappearance was granted a half-column under the headline "Hamper Vanishes, Raffle Mystery Deepens." The reporter, a young man with an appetite for drama, hinted at sinister forces and drew on phrases like locked room puzzles and parishioners baffled. Inspector Purbright read the article with his usual calm, though he did allow himself a faint sigh at the phrase "police baffled." He was not baffled, merely curious, and curiosity in Flaxborough was a more reliable companion than outrage. By dusk the raffle affair had reached the drawing-rooms of the genteel. Mrs. Gloss, who considered herself custodian of local morals, held forth that the crime proved the decline of civic standards. Colonel Creswick, overhearing at his club, muttered that the young were responsible. And in the quiet back parlour of the vicarage, the Reverend Mr. Coddington speculated that perhaps the basket had been removed by Providence, sparing the winner from foreign preservatives. All of this reached Purbright by degrees, carried in by Constable Love, whose enthusiasm for town chatter often outstripped his memory for regulations. He reported with solemnity that Mrs. Chubb was convinced of dark espionage, that the fishmonger blamed Methodists, and that an anonymous tip suggested the basket might have been sighted in a taxi bound for the next village. Purbright listened, recorded nothing, and finally remarked that until the basket itself reappeared, or was found being hawked by some unlikely peddler, the matter remained an incident rather than a crime. Love looked faintly disappointed, as though deprived of a scandal to boast of. Nevertheless, the inspector's manner concealed a subtle calculation. The pink ticket pinned so precisely to the mantelpiece was no accident. Someone had wanted to leave a signature, not merely take groceries. The town's swirl of rumours and conjectures provided a smokescreen, but the single ticket remained like a coin balanced on edge, waiting to fall. That evening, Purbright walked home through the lamp-lit streets, noting how each window seemed alive with the movement of people repeating and embroidering the story. In Flaxborough, truth often arrived last, limping behind gossip in ill-fitting shoes. Yet he knew it would arrive eventually, and his task was to make sure it did not go astray on the way. As he let himself into his modest house and hung his hat on its usual peg, Purbright reflected, not without a hint of dry amusement, that the theft of a raffle prize had brought more agitation to the town than a burglary or a brawl ever had. That in itself was instructive. People were not excited by the value of what was taken, but by the breach of expectation. Jonas Bligh had been granted his good fortune in full public view, and someone had quite deliberately robbed him of it. It was an impolite gesture in a very polite town, and impoliteness, Purbright thought, often spoke more loudly than theft. The following morning broke with the heavy stillness peculiar to small towns, when something faintly scandalous occurred. Flaxborough's streets hummed with restrained excitement. Shop doors opened onto whispers, and the postman, trudging along his route, was drawn into speculative conversations, as though his delivery bag carried not letters, but intelligence reports. Inspector Purbright, unmoved by such enthusiasm, began his morning in the ordinary way by reading through the constable's overnight log, which contained nothing of consequence beyond a complaint from a farmer about a hedge trimmer borrowed and never returned. He then telephoned Jonas Bligh, politely requesting a second conversation, this time without the housekeeper's interruptions. The pawnbroker's acceptance was couched in tones of reluctance, as though receiving visitors was an intrusion upon his rightful sulking. Purbright arrived at South Lane shortly before 11. Bligh, stout and well-kept in a suit that still bore the suggestion of pawnbroking prosperity, ushered him into the parlour. "I trust, Inspector, that you have made progress?" Bligh asked, with the kind of solemnity reserved for affairs of state. Purbright merely folded himself into a chair and observed, "Progress is generally less swift when one does not yet know in which direction it ought to move." Bligh harumphed, then leaned forward. "It was a deliberate act, sir. You must see that. They left the ticket, did they not? That's no random burglary. That's mockery, an insult to me, and by extension to order itself." "Who are they?" Purbright inquired gently. Bligh's eyes darted as though scanning a private ledger of enemies. "Could be almost anyone. I have not always been popular, Inspector. Success rarely is. Some debtors, though years have passed, may still nurse resentment, or perhaps envy the raffle win might have been salt in their wounds." The inspector allowed silence to stretch long enough for Bligh to begin fidgeting with his watch chain. Finally, Purbright remarked, "It would help, Mr. Bligh, if you could recall anyone at the raffle who appeared particularly struck by your good fortune." Bligh frowned. "There was old Mrs. Gloss, who looked as though she'd swallowed a wasp when my number was called, and Mr. Dabb from the ironmonger muttered something about typical under his breath. Nothing more than natural disappointment, though." Natural disappointment was not, Purbright thought, always as harmless as it sounded. He made a mental note. From South Lane, the inspector proceeded to St. Saviour's Vestry, where the raffle had been drawn. The vicar's wife received him with her usual apologetic air, as if his presence cast retrospective doubt upon the honesty of the parish event. She remembered the drawing clearly, though she confessed to having been distracted at the time by the teapot's refusal to yield its lid. It was Mr. Bligh's ticket beyond doubt, she assured him, and he accepted the basket without fuss. I cannot imagine what became of it. We were all rather relieved that it was not won by Mrs. Barraclough again. She has a way of putting her prizes to public use, you know, presses them upon one at committee teas. Quite dreadful sausage sandwiches we had once. Purbright expressed sympathy and asked whether anyone else had taken a marked interest in the prize. The vicar's wife thought not, though she vaguely recalled young Miss Fenning, the organist, remarking that the cheese looked like a weapon of war. This was hardly incriminating, but Purbright recorded the comment in his notebook. Remarks, however light, were sometimes more revealing than evidence. Next on his quiet circuit came Mrs. Barraclough herself. The redoubtable matron, encountered arranging tins in her pantry, welcomed the inspector with the relish of one long convinced of moral decay in others. It's Bligh's own fault, if you ask me, she declared. All that ostentation with his mantelpiece ornaments and fancy window boxes. Tempting Providence, that's what it is. And another thing, I saw him at the raffle eyeing the liquor in that hamper like a cat with cream. No doubt he's already drunk it and concocted this tale for sympathy. Purbright allowed the words to flow without interruption. He was well aware that suspicion, in Mrs. Barraclough's hands, was a versatile substance, capable of being moulded to fit any circumstance. Still, her assertion that Bligh might have invented the theft aligned with one of the more common rumours. By afternoon, the inspector had spoken with several others who had attended the raffle. Mr. Dabb, the ironmonger, repeated his mutterings, this time with less concealment. A blasted fix, that's what it was. Bligh wins everything. I'll always have luck. Wouldn't surprise me if he arranged the theft himself for more attention. Miss Fenning, the organist, proved a more nervous subject. She insisted she had noticed nothing unusual, but her pale cheeks and fluttering hands suggested she was unaccustomed to police inquiry. When Purbright gently repeated her remark about the cheese, she flushed crimson and protested that it was only a joke. The inspector, with his mild nod, did nothing to suggest disbelief, which seemed to unsettle her further. Constable Love, accompanying him on part of these visits, displayed the eager curiosity of a man expecting scandal behind every net curtain. He asked, more than once, whether Purbright believed espionage or smuggling might be involved, given the foreign origin of the goods. Purbright replied only that espionage was seldom so considerate as to leave raffle tickets pinned with brass drawing pins. By the end of the day, the inspector had collected impressions rather than facts. The town's reaction was more telling than the disappearance itself. Resentment towards Bligh, suspicion of exaggeration, nervousness from those with little to hide, yet much to lose in reputation. And among it all, the solitary pink ticket remained silent, deliberate, peculiar. That evening, back at the station, Purbright spread his notes across the desk. He was not yet ready to draw conclusions, but he recognized the pattern beginning to emerge. The theft of the basket, though trivial in value, had been executed with the care of a message. Whoever left that ticket intended more than mischief. They had sought to expose, to unsettle, or to humiliate. In a place like Flaxborough, where dignity often outweighed honesty, such motives were rarely in short supply. As he folded his notes away, Purbright thought again of Jonas Bligh's remark that jealousy is a stronger motive than hunger. Perhaps so. But envy, left to ferment, was capable of odder and crueler expressions than mere theft. By the time the week reached its midpoint, Flaxborough had all but selected its culprit. There was comfort in such matters in deciding early. Suspicion once lodged saved the trouble of searching further, and the town had agreed, with the usual blend of malice and relief, that the guilty party must be none other than Mr. Dabb, the ironmonger. Dabb was a man of quick temper and slow business. His shop, wedged between a haberdashery and the undertaker's, smelled faintly of rust and resentment. He was known to mutter darkly about luck favouring the undeserving, and his disdain for Bligh's success was no secret. It was therefore not long before whispers in the square hardened into certainty. In the tea shops, Dabb had stolen the hamper out of sheer spite. The theory suited the townsfolk well. It contained the right measure of envy, opportunity, and poetic justice. Moreover, it was neat. Neatness appealed to Flaxborough almost as much as gossip. Constable Love, keen to prove himself, reported the prevailing opinion to Purbright with enthusiasm, adding that several witnesses had heard Dabb grumble at the raffle. One claimed he had muttered something that might have been, "I'll see about that," when Bligh's number was announced. Love had even taken it upon himself to sketch a possible sequence of events: Dabb slipping from his shop after dark, creeping into South Lane, and somehow, by means left unexplained, removing the hamper without disturbing a latch. Purbright listened in his customary silence, watching a bead of rain slide down the station window. At length he remarked, "Constable, if Mr. Dabb wished to show his displeasure at losing the raffle, would it not have been simpler for him to voice it directly? He has, by all accounts, never concealed his grievances before." Love hesitated. "Well, sir, sometimes a man likes to make his point with a bit of mystery, leaves folk guessing." "Indeed," said Purbright mildly, "and sometimes it leaves the constabulary guessing also." Nevertheless, procedure required that Dabb be spoken to. Purbright, accompanied by Love, visited the ironmongery on a damp afternoon. The shop was empty of customers as usual, and Dabb himself stood behind the counter, polishing a hammer with unnecessary vigour. His face, weathered and sharp, brightened into a scowl at the sight of Purbright. "I suppose you've come about that blessed basket," he growled before the inspector had uttered a word. Purbright inclined his head. "The town has been discussing it." "The town," Dabb snapped, "is fit for nothing but wagging tongues. I didn't touch Bligh's hamper. Why should I? What use do I have for foreign cheese and tinned peaches? If I want sausage, I'll buy it myself." Love, unable to resist, observed, "It was a rather good bottle of wine, I hear." Dabb glared. "Then perhaps the inspector here should search the vicarage. That's where wine disappears fastest." Purbright let the insult to ecclesiastical temperance drift by. He asked instead whether Dabb could account for his movements on the night of the disappearance. "I was at home, reading the Chronicle. Ask my wife, though she won't thank you for it. If I'd gone out stealing hampers, don't you think she'd have noticed? She notices everything, that woman, even the way I fold my socks." It was not the kind of alibi to inspire conviction in the minds of neighbours, but Purbright detected in it a weary truth. A man cowed by domestic scrutiny was unlikely to risk the elaborate theatrics of theft and pinned raffle tickets. Still, news of the interview spread almost before Purbright and Love had returned to the station. Mrs. Chubb repeated that Dabb had been seen looking bitter at the raffle. Mrs. Barraclough declared she had always suspected him of dishonesty, and the colonel at the club pronounced that Dabb had the face of a criminal. A decision seemed to have been reached, and Flaxborough was pleased to rest its case. Only Purbright remained unmoved. His notes showed nothing beyond Dabb's public sourness and private tedium. Neither, he thought, was sufficient to account for the deliberate placing of the ticket. It was too pointed, too staged. and staging was not Dabb's style. He was a man of blunt remarks, not of subtleties. Yet the current town opinion ran too strongly to ignore. The superintendent, leaning heavily on consensus, advised Purbright to keep a watch on Dabb's movements. "It'll calm the place down," he said. "Folk like to see the police doing something." Purbright smiled politely, made a note to oblige, and then, when alone, put a small mark beside Miss Fenning's name in his notebook. The organist's fluster at their conversation, her insistence on the harmlessness of her remark, lingered in his mind. Not as evidence, certainly, but as one of those trifles that hovered at the edge of significance. For the moment, however, the tide of gossip had settled upon Dabb, and Purbright, with his usual patience, was content to let it wash there a while. People revealed themselves most clearly when convinced they had already solved a mystery. The inspector's task was to wait until the obvious gave way to the overlooked. As he walked home that evening through streets still humming with certainty about Dabb's guilt, Purbright reflected wryly that Flaxborough had once again demonstrated its knack for misplacing suspicion. The townsfolk loved nothing so much as a culprit close to hand, and Dabb, with his temper and his scowls, provided just that. Yet the pinned pink ticket remained, quietly and insistently, a puzzle demanding a subtler explanation. Inspector Purbright had long since learned that in Flaxborough the smallest matters overlooked by most often proved to be the most telling. So while the town busied itself with the agreeable conviction that Mr. Dabb had stolen the hamper, he returned his attention to the single object that had been left behind, the raffle ticket. The slip of pink paper lay still upon his desk, pinned neatly through its centre. Purbright turned it over, examining first the numbering, then the faint crease where it had been torn from its counterfoil. There was nothing remarkable in the ticket itself, just the cheap, poorer stock used for parish amusements, but the pin caught his eye. It was no ordinary drawing pin, the kind sold in cardboard boxes of 50 at Dabb's ironmongery. This one bore the faint, decorative trace of an embossed flower. The head had been pressed with some care, not a mass-produced article, but the sort once found in stationery sets given as gifts. Purbright sat for a while with the pin balanced in his palm, considering the type of person who might own such a thing. Not Jonas Bligh, certainly he favoured the utilitarian, and his housekeeper confirmed he had no fondness for ornaments in his stationery. Not Dabb either, who would sooner nail a notice to the wall than pin it. That left a narrower field, though still a broad town to walk through. Later that afternoon, Purbright made a deliberate detour into the post office, ostensibly to purchase stamps. Mrs. Gedge, the postmistress, kept a small glass cabinet beside the counter in which were displayed novelty pens, floral writing paper, and, just as the inspector suspected, packets of decorative drawing pins with embossed designs. "We sell a few now and again," Mrs. Gedge said, bustling to unlock the case. "Young ladies like them for pinning up dance cards or theatre programmes. I believe Miss Fenning bought a set before Christmas. She said they were useful for keeping her sheet music from sliding." The inspector expressed a polite interest in the weather and departed with his stamps, leaving the cabinet untouched. Outside, he paused briefly on the pavement, allowing the drizzle to collect on his hat brim while he digested this small, stubborn fact. The town, meanwhile, showed no appetite for such subtleties. The Chronicle ran a follow-up piece headlined "Ironmonger Silent on Hamper Allegations," which pleased its reporter, though it had been nothing more than Dabb slamming the shop door at his approach. Mrs. Chubb told anyone who would listen that the police were closing in. Colonel Creswick declared at the club that Dabb would break within a week. Purbright, untroubled by such certainty, made his way once more to St. Saviour's. In the vestry he found the vicar's wife folding choir surplices with an air of penitent diligence. She recalled Miss Fenning's remark about the cheese, blushing slightly at its frivolity, and admitted she had noticed the girl carrying a small case of stationery on raffle night. "I thought it rather charming," she said, though perhaps a little excessive for a church function. "But she is a nervous young thing, always seems to want to be prepared." Purbright nodded, as though the information were no more than passing interest, and gently turned the conversation to parish matters. But when he left, he carried with him the image of the pink ticket and its floral pin, now anchored to a shy organist whose cheeks had flamed at the merest suggestion of humour. The next day, as a matter of routine, Purbright visited Bligh's house once more. The pawnbroker greeted him with impatience, demanding to know why no arrest had yet been made. Purbright listened, and then, with mildness, asked whether Bligh had ever entertained Miss Fenning as a guest. Bligh blinked. "The organist? No. Why should I? I've nothing to do with music. I don't even like hymns." The inspector let the matter drop, but his mind was not entirely satisfied. He noted the faint irritation in Bligh's tone, the defensive quickness of his answer. Bligh's relations with the townsfolk were often prickly, but this particular protest seemed too swift, too pointed. That evening, Constable Love, who had been dispatched to keep an eye on Dab, returned disappointed, having found the ironmonger at home polishing tools and complaining about the Chronicle. Love then reported with boyish excitement that Miss Fenning had been seen leaving the post office with a small parcel. Purbright, filing this without comment, observed only that gossip had a way of supplying him with the same names more often than coincidence required. He thanked Love, closed his notebook, and sat for a long while staring at the single pink ticket on his desk. It was nothing in the eyes of most, a scrap of paper, a pin of no value, yet it was too deliberate to ignore, too carefully placed to be random. The town was content with its obvious suspect, but Purbright sensed the truth would emerge not from envy or bluster, but from the quiet habits of someone overlooked, someone who possessed, perhaps, a box of floral pins and an anxious desire to be thought insignificant. For now, he said nothing. Flaxborough was never short of opinions, and it would be wise to let them flow unchecked. The trivial detail was best kept close until it revealed its full weight. The inspector, in his patience, knew that trifles had a way of growing large when no one else paid them attention. The following days did little to cool the town's appetite for the raffle affair. If anything, the suspicion of Mr. Dab had begun to lose some of its shine, for suspicion, like jam, was at its most appealing when freshly opened. By Thursday, the Chronicle was recycling its details, the tea shops had grown weary of hearing about hammers and sour expressions, and people's curiosity shifted naturally toward fresher possibilities. Inspector Purbright, with his usual discretion, was content to let the tide of attention widen. He had already noted the peculiarity of the floral pin and Miss Fenning's delicate involvement, but he made no haste. Instead, he chose to wander quietly through town, asking questions about matters so small that most considered them unrelated. It was in these unconsidered corners that he expected the pattern to thicken. At the confectioner's, Mrs. Chubb confided that she had seen Jonas Bligh only a day before the raffle purchasing several bars of chocolate and indulgence she thought uncharacteristic for a man so frugal. She hinted darkly that Bligh might be preparing to impress someone. At the draper's, Miss Liversedge, who prided herself on noticing things, claimed she had observed the pawnbroker loitering outside the church hall earlier than necessary on raffle night, as if he had come to survey the prizes in advance. Such fragments, though inconsistent, added threads to the fabric of curiosity. Purbright followed these with mild inquiries into the vicarage circle. The Reverend Mr. Coddington, pressed to reflect upon the matter, declared with solemnity that the theft must be a test of faith. His wife, however, let slip that the mothers' union had been quietly relieved when Bligh won the basket, since there had been awkward concern that one or two other possible winners might refuse such foreign goods on grounds of digestion or temperance. She mentioned Mrs. Gloss in particular, who had expressed disgust at the wine. This remark led Purbright to pay a call upon Mrs. Gloss, a woman whose thin frame was matched only by the sharpness of her tongue. She insisted she had been unjustly denied the basket, that her ticket had been next in sequence, and that Bligh's triumph was an affront to Providence. When pressed, she admitted she would not have touched the bottle, the sausage, or the cheese, but felt none the less that she had been robbed of her rightful prize. She spoke with the fervour of one wronged by heaven itself, and Purbright noted how resentment could flourish even in the absence of desire. In the library, meanwhile, Miss Teatley, the chief assistant, reported that Miss Fenning had borrowed a slim volume on Italian cooking not long before the raffle. Unlikely reading, she added with a prim sniff, for a girl who scarcely manages beans on toast. Purbright thanked her and filed the details silently beside the floral pin. Constable Love, dispatched to gather whatever murmurs could be heard in the hand and shears, returned, full of excitement. He declared that 2 regulars had mentioned seeing a taxi late on the night of the raffle, leaving South Lane with a large, ribboned package on its back seat. The driver, when questioned, claimed it was just groceries collected for an anonymous fare. Love presented this information with the satisfaction of a man unwrapping treasure. Purbright merely observed that groceries often travelled by taxi, particularly when the weather was damp, and that anonymity was hardly suspicious in a village where everyone pried. Still he wrote down the note with care. There was, he thought, something in the notion of the basket travelling unseen through the night, while its owner grumbled at a lodge meeting. By the week's end, the field of characters connected, however loosely, to the affair had grown considerably. Dabb remained the town's favourite villain, Mrs. Gloss the self-proclaimed victim, Miss Fenning the nervous witness, and Bligh himself the aggrieved sufferer. Around them hovered smaller figures, the vicar's wife with her mild distractions, Mrs. Barraclough with her moral condemnations, even Mrs. Chubb with her appetite for embellishment. Each, in some way, had contributed to the swelling narrative. What intrigued Purbright most was not the theft itself, but the elaborate theatre surrounding it. A basket removed without trace, a ticket pinned with decorative precision, rumours of taxis, foreign cookery books, and jealous neighbours, each detail seemed designed to provoke speculation rather than conceal truth. The crime, such as it was, appeared less a theft than a performance staged for an audience of gossipers. As Purbright walked home one evening, passing the lamplit windows where curtains twitched and voices carried, he allowed himself a thin smile. In Flaxborough, people often mistook performance for privacy. They believed themselves secretive while acting in full view of their neighbours, and the one who had stolen the basket, he suspected, had counted upon exactly that confusion that gossip would cloud judgment more effectively than any locked door. He paused at his gate, turned once more the floral pin between his fingers, and thought of Miss Fenning's anxious cheeks, of Mrs. Gloss's indignation, of Bligh's watch-chain turning in nervous hands. The field had widened, as it always must, but the circle of truth was slowly contracting. Somewhere among these petty grievances and social discomforts lay the purpose behind the theft, and when it revealed itself, it would likely seem as trivial as the pin itself, yet decisive. The town had just begun to tire of its speculation when a second disturbance occurred, lending fresh vitality to tongues that had briefly grown weary. It arrived one damp Friday morning in the form of an indignant Mrs. Gloss, who burst into the police station carrying a wicker basket, though not the one that had been lost. This basket contained a few withered vegetables, a chipped teacup, and a note pinned ostentatiously to the lining. "It was left on my doorstep," she declared, voice quivering with both triumph and outrage. "Another insult, Inspector. A message from whoever took that hamper, mocking me now as well as Bly. You must act before they bring disgrace on the whole parish." Purbright rose slowly from his desk and examined the offering. The note was scrawled in block letters upon a sheet torn from a hymn book. "Better luck next time." And fastening it unmistakably was another of the floral pins. The inspector held it between finger and thumb, turning it so that the light caught the embossed design. "You did not see who left this?" he asked. "I am not in the habit of keeping vigil at the window," Mrs. Gloss snapped, though her neighbours would have contradicted her. "I discovered it at first light. Whoever did this must have crept about in the dead of night." Constable Love, who had appeared behind her, regarded the basket as though it were contraband treasure. "Same hand as the first, sir?" "Must be. This proves it's not just a one-off." Purbright allowed that possibility, but made no pronouncement. Instead, he dismissed Mrs. Gloss with a promise of further attention and carried the basket into his office. There he set the two pins side by side. Identical, not only decorative but faintly worn, suggesting frequent use. He imagined them plucked from a little pot on some desk or dressing table, employed daily to fix scraps of paper, tickets, or reminders. They had an owner, these pins, and that owner was not careless enough to fail to notice their absence. The news of Mrs. Gloss's basket spread with the speed of a gale. The Chronicle printed an extra paragraph headlined, "Second Basket Mystery Deepens Confusion." The Hand and Shears debated loudly whether the culprit was making fools of the police. At the drapery, Miss Liversedge whispered that the whole business smacked of a lady's mischief, a remark that sent nods and pursed lips rippling through the clientele. Miss Fenning, unfortunately for her nerves, found herself once more a subject of speculation. She appeared at choir practice pale and distracted, fumbling with her hymn sheets as though every note carried accusation. The vicar's wife, moved to sympathy, confided to Purbright that the girl was quite undone by the gossip. Purbright, hearing this, asked gently whether Miss Fenning had misplaced any belongings of late. The vicar's wife hesitated before admitting that the girl had complained of missing one or two drawing pins from her stationery case, though she had thought nothing of it at the time. The inspector merely nodded, thanked her, and turned the conversation to parish accounts. That evening, Jonas Bly stormed once more into the station, demanding to know why Mrs. Gloss's insult had been treated with seriousness, while his loss still languished unsolved. He accused the police of partiality, the Mothers' Union of incompetence, and the entire town of conspiracy. Purbright listened with serene patience, his gaze resting on the man's twitching watch chain, and finally replied that the matter was unlikely to be advanced by shouting. Bly, deflated, departed, muttering. But Purbright's thoughts lingered on the connection between the two incidents. Both victims had been linked by raffle disappointment. Bly, the ostentatious winner; Mrs. Gloss, the indignant near miss. Both had been mocked by the deliberate placement of tokens, the ticket, the pin, the note. And in both cases the act seemed intended less to deprive than to humiliate. On Saturday morning, Purbright made his way to the library again. Miss Teatley greeted him with the nervous eagerness of one accustomed to guarding secrets of no consequence. Asked casually about Miss Fenning, she admitted the girl had returned the Italian cookery book unread. Said she didn't have the time, but she looked quite flustered, Inspector, really quite agitated. The inspector thanked her, then strolled through the stacks until he reached the notice board. Several leaflets were pinned there, lectures, jumble sales, a lost cat. The pins, he noticed, bore the same embossed flower. He asked Miss Teatley whether these belonged to the library. She flushed and said no, that they were supplied by one of the assistants who liked to keep things neat. It was, of course, Miss Fenning. Purbright returned to the station with this detail resting quietly in his mind. He did not share it with Constable Love, who was already carried away by theories of a serial prankster. Instead, he placed the second floral pin beside the first and sat gazing at them both. Two trivial objects, yet together they formed a chain strong enough to bind the entire affair. What struck him most was not the pins themselves, but the effort they represented. Someone had risked notice to carry a basket across town at night, to prepare mocking notes, to select tokens that would be recognized. It was not greed, it was a campaign conducted with a peculiar blend of malice and restraint. The second incident had broadened the game, but to Purbright it had also narrowed the suspect. He could almost hear the faint rustle of paper, see the nervous hands pressing pins into place. Yet he would not move too quickly. In Flaxborough, the truth revealed itself best when permitted to stroll out in its own time, preferably while everyone else was running in circles. So he leaned back in his chair, closed his notebook, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The raffle riddle was no longer about a missing basket. It had become something richer. Someone was performing for the whole town, and performances always betrayed the actor in the end. Inspector Purbright had always considered that human nature, if left to its own devices, was usually kind enough to explain itself. The difficulty lay not in forcing confessions, but in learning to listen while people betrayed themselves in ways they scarcely noticed. It was in this spirit that he approached the riddle of the baskets, and it was with that same patience that he settled one evening into the quiet of his office, laying out the elements as neatly as a parish tea table. First, there was Jonas Bligh, prosperous, disliked, and faintly theatrical in his grievance. His indignation seemed genuine, yet Purbright could not dismiss the possibility that Bligh's vanity might relish the attention a theft could bring. He was not a man to invent humiliation, but neither was he incapable of stage-managing drama if it kept him in the centre of the town's gaze. Still, the pins did not fit him. Bligh had little taste for ornaments, and his hands twitched too nervously to have pressed them with such careful neatness. Then there was Mrs. Gloss, self-proclaimed near winner of the raffle, and now recipient of a mocking basket. Her grievance was as sharp as her tongue, her sense of injustice boundless. Yet Purbright could not imagine her creeping through the night with a hamper in her arms, nor troubling herself to press pins into notes. She was too fond of indignation to spend energy manufacturing it. Dab, the ironmonger, remained the town's official villain, but Purbright had watched the man's blunt candour and weary temper with experienced eyes. A culprit, eager to wound with symbolism and wit, would hardly have chosen Dab's gruff simplicity as their disguise. No, the ironmonger's guilt lived only in gossip, not in truth. And then Miss Fenning. She hovered on the periphery of all this, pale and nervous, her hands fluttering over hymn sheets, her blushes rising at the slightest question. She possessed the very pins used in the mockeries. She had borrowed a foreign cookery book, then returned it unread, as if drawn toward the exotic and then repelled by its strangeness. Her life, lived in the careful margins of parish activity, might well have left her craving some dramatic expression, a secret performance no one could suspect of a timid organist. Purbright did not judge her guilty, not yet, but he recognized in her the fragile outline of motive. Beyond the individuals, there was the pattern of the acts themselves, the theft of Bligh's basket, the mocking note to Mrs. Glossney, the crime gained anything tangible. The goods of the hamper had not reappeared on market stalls, and no profit had been made. Instead, the reward lay in the spectacle. Whoever engineered these scenes wanted to unsettle, to provoke laughter at the pompous and irritation at the self-righteous. It was theatre, pure and mischievous, played out upon the narrow stage of Flaxborough's gossip. Purbright closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again the rising tones of Bligh's indignation, the shrill edge of Mrs. Gloss's outrage, the heavy certainty of townsfolk convinced that Dab was their villain. Each had been given their role, and each had played it with gusto. And always, somewhere unseen, the stage hand pinned their tokens and prepared the next cue. That evening, as he walked home past the dim glow of shop windows, Purbright thought about the curious balance of small-town life. People treasured their respectability as one might guard a fragile ornament, yet beneath it lay layers of envy, pettiness, and longing. A raffle basket could stir emotions greater than a banknote because it carried the public weight of fortune and favour. To win was to be noticed, to lose was to be slighted, and to be mocked in either condition was to be wounded indeed. He paused at the corner near the drapery and watched two women conversing in whispers that ended in sharp laughter. It was always laughter that betrayed the deepest cruelties, he reflected. In Flaxborough, people dressed their malice in humour and told themselves it was harmless. Yet it was laughter that had cut Bligh down to size, that had needled Mrs. Gloss, that had left Miss Fenning trembling. Back in his modest sitting-room, Purbright poured himself a small whisky and sat by the fire. He considered the pins once more resting on the desk before him. They represented care, delicacy, even a hint of vanity qualities foreign to Bligh, Dab, and Mrs. Gloss, but not to a nervous young woman who treasured her stationery and sought comfort in small, orderly possessions. He thought of her returning the cookery book, ashamed, perhaps, at her own daring curiosity. He thought of her blushes when confronted, her insistence that her remark about the cheese was only a joke. People often apologized for jokes because they carried truths uncomfortably close to the surface. Purbright did not leap to conclusions. He never did. Instead, he let the shape of the matter form quietly in his mind, like a shadow on mist. Someone had found a way to turn the raffle into theatre, to elevate a trivial parish amusement into a drama played before the whole town. The audience was enraptured, convinced of Dab's guilt, entertained by Bligh's bluster, enthralled by Mrs. Gloss's indignation. And in the wings stood a hand too timid to step forward but too restless to stay silent. The inspector finished his whisky and set down the glass. He had reached no final answer, but he had sketched the outline. All that remained was to fill in the colour. He would not rush. The guilty, he knew, often revealed themselves by their own impatience. He would ask one or two questions at the right moment, in the right tone, and watch carefully which hands began to tremble. For now Flaxborough bustled with its own theatre, rehearsing its gossip and revising its suspicions. Purbright, with his quiet irony, was content to let them perform. The truth, after all, was patient, and he was in no hurry. Inspector Purbright believed that the surest way to draw out the truth was to let it think it was safe. He had spent several days allowing Flaxborough to quarrel and whisper itself into conviction, content to let Dab remain the people's favourite villain. Yet he knew that the guilty hand was one that trembled more subtly, and it was time to place the smallest of weights upon it. The opportunity arrived with the Mothers' Union tea, a monthly ritual in which sandwiches of determined blandness were consumed beneath the faint chill of the parish hall. Purbright attended on the pretext of reassuring the committee that inquiries continued, but in reality he wished to observe. Miss Fenning was there, pale as ever, her hands fluttering over a stack of hymn sheets she had been asked to sort. Jonas Bligh presided with sour pomposity, declaring once again that he had been robbed of his prize. Mrs. Gloss hovered nearby, her eyes sharp, her lips tight, as if ready to spring upon any hint of neglect. Purbright accepted a cup of weak tea and listened with grave courtesy. "When the moment was right," he remarked with deliberate mildness, "it is curious, is it not, that the pin left at Mr. Bligh's should match so precisely the one found in the basket left at Mrs. Gloss's door. A decorative sort not much used by gentlemen, they are the kind young ladies tend to favour." He said no more and allowed the words to settle like dust in the air. Conversation wavered. Bligh blinked at his watch. Chain. Mrs. Gloss leaned forward as though sensing confirmation of her grievances, and Miss Fenning, though she tried to steady herself, dropped an entire sheaf of hymn sheets with a nervous cry. Constable Love, present with all the tact of a man on parade, stooped clumsily to gather the sheets. Fenning's hands, shaking as they were, betrayed her further in reaching to reclaim the papers. She pulled from her bag a small case that snapped open to reveal, if only for an instant, the bright glint of embossed floral pins. The moment was brief, almost invisible, but Purbright's eyes caught it. He made no outward sign. Instead, he stooped himself to assist with the hymn sheets, murmuring a word of reassurance to the flustered girl, and returned to his seat as though nothing had occurred. Later, as the tea droned on, he asked Bligh in an even tone, "Did you ever taste the sausage before it was taken?" Bligh spluttered, offended. "Of course not. Do you think I'd squander my property before displaying it in full? The whole thing vanished before I had the chance." "Just so," Purbright replied quietly, watching Fenning's pale profile stiffen as if the very mention of the contents pricked at her. Mrs. Gloss muttered approval, and the vicar's wife sighed with relief that the conversation had returned to more ordinary complaints. But Purbright, behind his mild expression, knew he had achieved what he wanted. When the meeting dispersed, he walked slowly back to the station, Constable Love at his side chattering eagerly about decisive clues and clear suspects. Purbright allowed the enthusiasm to flow unchecked, but in his mind he replayed the image of the dropped pins, the tremor of hands, the sudden blanch of colour at a trivial question. That evening he summoned Miss Fenning under the pretext of clarifying her recollections of the raffle night. She arrived hesitant, clutching her handbag as if it were armour. Purbright received her with courtesy, offered her a chair, and spoke of parish matters until her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then, with the gentlest of questions, he asked whether she had ever mislaid any of her pins. Her answer came too quickly. "Nowell, perhaps one or two, but that happens, doesn't it? They roll under things or get borrowed." Purbright nodded as though entirely persuaded and let silence follow. It was a silence heavy enough to stir nerves. She shifted in her chair, fidgeted with her bag clasp, and finally blurted, "It wasn't me, Inspector. I've never stolen anything. I couldn't." "I haven't suggested you have," Purbright said kindly, "but I cannot help noticing that you seem to feel accused." Her eyes filled with tears then, not of guilt, but of pressure, the pressure of gossip, of being overlooked, of being too slight and timid to bear the weight of scrutiny. Purbright leaned back and said no more. She composed herself eventually, and he dismissed her with a gentle word. When she was gone, he sat for a long while in the quiet office considering. His test had confirmed the tremor he suspected. The theft of the basket and the mocking note were not acts of greed or even spite, but of theatre. Someone had sought to create drama where life had offered none, to wield the smallest of props, raffle tickets, a floral pin, into a story that would enthrall the town. The test had unsettled the guilty hand, though not yet enough to force it into the open. That moment would come, but it must be arranged with care. Flaxborough's stage was crowded with actors, all too eager to play their roles, and Purbright knew the final act required nothing louder than a polite question placed in the right ear, at the right time. Until then, he allowed the town to continue its performance, content to watch as suspicion and gossip rehearsed their lines. He knew that when the curtain finally fell, it would not be on the figure everyone had jeered at, but on the one who had been most desperate to remain in the shadows. Inspector Purbright knew that revelations, if they were to be accepted in Flaxborough, must be delivered with civility. A culprit might be unmasked in the town's imagination long before the truth emerged, but the actual moment required calm surroundings, polite tones, and a sense that the matter had been settled with no more fuss than a change of hymn number. He chose, therefore, the vestry of St. Saviour's for his gathering. It was a neutral space, modestly furnished, with chairs arranged for a committee that never quite met. The vicar lent his blessing, provided tea, and discreetly withdrew. Present were Jonas Bligh, blustering with indignation, Mrs. Gloss, stiff with expectation. Mr. Dabb, dragged unwillingly from his ironmongery and looking like a man sentenced to polish locks forever, and Miss Fenning, pale, anxious, her handbag clasped tightly on her lap. Purbright began with gentle courtesy, speaking not of guilt, but of confusion. We have all, I think, been troubled by the oddity of these incidents. A raffle basket disappearing, a mocking note appearing, and each accompanied by the curious use of decorative pins. At first glance, these acts appear to be petty mischief, yet they carry too much precision, too deliberate a sense of theatre, to be dismissed as trivial. Bligh snorted, declaring that his loss was not trivial at all. Mrs. Gloss snapped that her insult was intolerable. Dabb muttered darkly about wasted time. Purbright let them have their protests and then continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. The raffle basket contained articles of little value in themselves. No one has attempted to sell them, nor even to consume them, as far as I can tell. What was sought was not possession, but displayed the creation of a story. And what is a story without its audience? In Flaxborough, gossip is the stage, and each of you has been given a role. He paused, allowing the room to grow still. Miss Fenning shifted, slightly, her handbag pressed closer to her knees. Mr. Dabb was cast as the villain, Mrs. Gloss as the aggrieved, Mr. Bligh as the strutting sufferer. The town played along with enthusiasm. But the stagehand, the one who placed the props, who prepared the notes and the pins, remained hidden, or thought to remain so. Purbright opened his notebook, though he scarcely glanced at it. The pins, you see, were distinctly embossed with a small flower. They are not sold in Dabb's shop, nor kept by Bligh, nor hoarded by Mrs. Gloss. They are, however, found in the stationery case of a certain young lady who, perhaps without quite intending it, let them fall from her bag at the Mothers' Union tea. Miss Fenning made a sound, half gasp, half protest, but Purbright raised a hand gently. "Please, Miss Fenning, I have no wish to humiliate you. I mean only to explain what has happened, so that it may end with no more cruelty than has already been endured." Bligh barked in astonishment, Mrs. Gloss exclaimed her disbelief, and Dabb muttered something unprintable. Purbright went on, unruffled. "You returned a foreign cookery book unread, Miss Fenning. You blushed at the mere mention of the cheese. You are not a thief in the ordinary sense. You took the basket not to gain from it, but to rearrange the pattern of things, to make the parish notice what it usually overlooks. You pinned your tokens carefully because you wished the act to be understood as a message, not a crime. And when Mrs. Gloss complained of injustice, you gave her a basket of nonsense with another pin, mocking her indignation as you mocked Bligh's pride." Miss Fenning shook her head, tears bright in her eyes. "I didn't mean I only wanted her to falter, unable to finish." Purbright leaned forward, his tone still quiet, almost paternal. "You wanted to disturb the order that weighed so heavily upon you, to show that respectability could be unsettled by something as small as a raffle ticket. And you succeeded, Miss Fenning. The whole town has been talking of nothing else. There was a long silence. Bligh looked thunderstruck, Mrs. Gloss affronted, Dab oddly relieved. Miss Fenning, trembling, clutched her bag tighter as though it could shield her from the stares. Purbright closed his notebook with a soft snap. The law may consider theft, but the parish will consider folly. I see little profit in dragging a timid young woman through the courts over a basket of sausage and foreign wine. The items, I believe, have already been quietly disposed of. What remains is the lesson that mockery can wound as deeply as envy, and that laughter, in Flaxborough, is a dangerous weapon. He rose, signalling that the matter was at an end. Mr. Bligh, you have lost your hamper, but gained notoriety. Mrs. Gloss, you have been insulted but also vindicated. Mr. Dab, you may now polish your hammers in peace, and Miss Fenning takes care where you place your pins in future. They tell more of your heart than you realize. With that, he offered each a courteous nod and left the vestry, his tread unhurried, his manner serene. The case, such as it was, had found its conclusion, though not perhaps the one the town expected. For Purbright, it was never about the hamper, nor even about the theft, but about the peculiar shapes that human frailty takes when pressed by envy, pride, and loneliness. And in the end, it was a raffle ticket, pinned neatly to a mantelpiece, that had given the game away. Flaxborough never let go of a scandal gracefully. He preferred to chew it over until the flavour was gone. The raffle affair, having received its formal resolution in the vestry, began its slow descent from the high table of gossip to the back benches of reminiscence. Still for several days tongues worked with energy, and those who had not been present at the reveal were treated to embroidered versions that bore only faint resemblance to Purbright's calm recital. Jonas Bligh, despite his indignation, found himself uncomfortably transformed into a figure of fun. He could scarcely step into the high street without someone remarking, in tones of forced innocence, "Keeping an eye on your groceries, Mr. Bligh?" The mockery stung, though he tried to counter it with displays of dignity, parading in his best hat and watch chain. Yet he knew, as did the town, that he had been brought low not by theft, but by laughter, and there was no pawnshop ledger stout enough to balance that account. Mrs. Gloss enjoyed a brief moment of sympathy, which she squandered almost immediately by insisting that her basket of withered vegetables had been a calculated attempt on her reputation. When sympathy turned to irritation, she retreated to her drawing-room, where she rehearsed fresh grievances for a quieter audience of china figurines. Mr. Dab, much relieved to be released from the role of villain, resumed his work in the ironmongery with renewed enthusiasm. He polished the handles of saws and placed new padlocks in the window, each as if it were a trophy of vindication. He told anyone who would listen that he had never doubted Purbright's sense, though privately he nursed a bitterness at the ease with which his neighbours had condemned him. As for Miss Fenning, her fate was of a quieter kind. The parish whispered, certainly, but whispers about a timid young organist lacked the spice of scandal. Some pitied her, others shook their heads, but the majority quickly lost interest. She played the hymns on Sunday with hands that trembled only slightly, and if she seemed paler than before, it was attributed to the draughts in the church. Purbright had arranged matters so that no formal charge was pressed. The Mothers' Union, after much frowning, agreed that forgiveness was Christian, provided the girl never again interfered with raffle property. The Chronicle, eager for one last flourish, printed a piece under the headline, "Inspector explains hamper riddle. No charge to be brought." The article struck a balance between moral outrage and civic relief, concluding with a solemn remark that the incident proves even the smallest objects may disturb the peace of a respectable town. Readers nodded as though this confirmed what they had long suspected. For Purbright, the affair wound itself down with the same quiet rhythm it had begun. He filed his notes neatly, placed the 2 floral pins in a small envelope, and tucked it into a drawer. There was no need to keep them as evidence, they served better as reminders. Cases in Flaxborough were rarely about the value of what was lost. They were about the value people imagined in reputation, attention, and the delicate theatre of respectability. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk sorting through paperwork on dog licenses and motor lamp defects, Constable Love ventured a question. "Do you think she'll do it again, sir?" "Miss Fenning, I mean." Purbright looked up mildly. "People seldom repeat the same play, Love. Once the town has seen the trick, it is no longer theatre." Love considered this, frowning slightly. "Still, sir, it was clever. I'd never have thought of it being her, nor," Purbright said gently, "did she expect to be thought of at all. That was her miscalculation." With that he returned to his papers, dipping his pen with the care of a man who preferred ink to gossip. Outside the station the market square bustled as it always did, traders calling their wares, neighbours exchanging the newest rumours, children darting between barrows. The raffle affair was already being nudged aside by talk of an upcoming flower show where, it was confidently predicted, the competition for first prize begonias would involve more intrigue than any hamper of sausage and wine. As dusk fell, Purbright walked home through the familiar streets, past windows glowing with lamplight and curtains drawn against the night. He reflected, not without amusement, that Flaxborough had once more provided its small reminder of human nature, that pride and envy could dress themselves in the humblest of disguises, and that the sharpest weapon in town was not theft nor threat, but the sly laughter of neighbours. He hung his hat on its usual peg, stacked the day's files in patient order, and prepared himself for the next quiet absurdity the town might offer. For in Flaxborough one could always rely on the ordinary to conceal something just a little peculiar.